Okay, so let's get into this. Today we're diving into a question that, well, it might make some of us feel a bit uncomfortable, but it's definitely real-world stuff.
Yeah.
In some situations, does money actually, matter more than relationships?
hmm
We're going to explore this using some interesting source material. It's excerpts from this fictional podcast, English podcast show, and they have an episode called Why Some Money Matters Over Relationships.
Right.
And our goal here isn't really to land on a simple yes or no answer, because let's face it, there probably isn't one. It's more about digging into the complexities, the nuances, and maybe giving you a kind of fresh perspective on this whole tricky dynamic.
Yeah, and what's interesting straight away, I think, is how the hosts in that source, Alex and Jamie, they just face it head on. They say, look, this can sound cold, maybe even a bit controversial,
Yeah, they do.
but then they immediately ground it in like practical reality. Life isn't always neat and tidy, and sometimes basic needs, survival, even, well, they just have to be part of the equation.
Absolutely.
And that honesty right from the start, I think it kind of sets the stage for a necessary chat, even if it feels a bit awkward.
Totally. And to make it really concrete,
hmm
we're going to look closely at a specific story that Jamie shares on that show.
Okay.
It's about a time they apparently had to choose their own financial well-being over a friendship. And this friendship, it sounds like it had become, well, a real drain. Not just emotionally, but financially too.
Ah, right. I remember reading that bit. They were giving a lot of money.
Yeah, apparently consistently providing financial support. So much so that it started hitting their own mental health and their bank balance.
Oh,
So it's a pretty stark example of how sometimes focusing on money isn't about greed. It's more about like self-preservation, protecting yourself.
that really hits on a key idea, doesn't it? Money acting as a kind of boundary.
Exactly.
In Jamie's situation, pouring more money into that friendship, it wasn't really helping anymore. It sounds like it had become enabling, maybe, and
Yeah.
actually harmful in the long run.
Right. For both of them, probably.
Yeah, possibly. So by pulling back financially, Jamie was essentially drawing a line. A necessary one, it sounds like, a healthy boundary.
Hmm.
It makes you ask, though, where is that line between being supportive and just enabling something negative, and how does money fit into that? It's tricky.
It really is. And it's not just those big dramatic situations either, is it?
Mm.
The source also mentions how, just the day-to-day grind of financial stress can wear down even really strong relationships.
Oh, for sure.
They talk about couples breaking up because they're just constantly fighting about money,
Yeah.
bills, saving for the future. Maybe one person spends differently than the other, all that stuff.
Yeah, that constant pressure.
It just shows how a lack of financial stability or even just financial agreement can kind of erode the foundation of a relationship no matter how much affection was there to begin with.
Precisely. And we all know that saying money can't buy happiness. And yeah, on one level, sure, just having wealth doesn't guarantee you'll be happy.
Right.
But as Alex and Jamie point out in their discussion, it's pretty hard to even think about happiness when you're stressed about basic needs. Like, can you pay the electric bill this month?
Yeah, good point.
That kind of fundamental stress, it just highlights how money does provide a level of security, a baseline that really impacts our overall well-being.
Which then affects our relationships.
Absolutely. It affects our capacity for relationships. If you're constantly worried about keeping the lights on, it's hard to be present and nurturing for someone else.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this leads to another really interesting question they bring up. Is it automatically shallow if someone chooses financial stability over starting or continuing a romantic relationship?
Ooh, yeah, that's a loaded one.
It is. But Alex, in the source, argues it can actually be a sign of self-awareness,
Yeah.
like being honest with yourself.
Oh.
Well, if you recognize that your own financial goals, or just your needs for security, are fundamentally mismatched with a potential partner's,
Mm.
acknowledging that isn't necessarily superficial. It could just be, realistic about long-term prospects.
I see that. But as Jamie then points out, making that kind of choice, it often comes with a heavy dose of social judgment.
Oh, definitely. The gold digger label gets thrown around pretty fast, doesn't it?
Okay.
Especially online.
Right. So there's this real tension between what might be a very practical, maybe even sensible personal decision for someone's future,
Mm.
and how society expects us to prioritize romance above all else. It kind of exposes those conflicting cultural messages we get about love and money.
It really does. And sticking with that long-term idea, the source also hammers home that financial compatibility isn't just a nice to have, It's pretty vital for partnerships that last.
Yeah, they give that example of a marriage where, say, one person is carrying all the financial weight, doing all the earning or saving, and the other isn't contributing much in that department.
Right.
You can just imagine the resentment building up over time in a situation like that.
Oh, absolutely. It could create these deep cracks, couldn't it? Even if they started out really loving each other, that constant imbalance would be tough.
Definitely tough. And it's also interesting how money situations can sometimes act um, like a catalyst or
Yeah.
maybe a magnifying glass for issues already there.
What do you mean? Like inheritance disputes?
Exactly like inheritance disputes. That's a classic example they probably mentioned. Suddenly, families or close relationships that seemed fine, they just fracture.
Yeah.
Sometimes beyond repair, all over dividing up assets.
Yeah.
It's like the money doesn't cause the problem, but it forces underlying tensions, maybe old resentments or disagreements, right out into the open, stuff that was maybe easier to ignore before.
Right, when there wasn't a pile of cash on the table making it unavoidable.
Precisely.
So, if we kind of zoom out and look at the overall picture the fictional hosts are painting,
Yeah.
it feels like money often stands in for some really basic things, doesn't it? Like security, a certain amount of freedom or
Yeah.
options, maybe even a feeling of having some control or power over your life.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Security, freedom, power. And sometimes having those things is essential for relationships to actually work a lot, not just survive, but really thrive.
It shifts the perspective a bit, doesn't it?
It does. It helps to maybe reframe money, not as like the enemy of love, but more as a tool.
A tool. Right.
Yeah, like any tool, right? It can be used well or it can be used badly. Its impact really depends on how it's handled within the relationship.
So it can build things up, help create stability.
Or if it's mismanaged or becomes a source of constant conflict, it can cause a lot of damage. The key isn't just the money itself, but how people navigate it together. Or sometimes how they have to navigate it alone for their own sake.
Which loops us back perfectly to that central question from the English podcast show episode. How do we balance it all? The need for financial stability, the importance of our relationships. How do we manage both without losing ourselves? It seems less about a hard rule, always choose this, never choose that, and more about, I guess, understanding why financial stuff might need to take priority sometimes, and how to handle those moments with, honesty and self-respect.
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of recap what we've touched on from the source, we've seen how putting financial peace first can actually be about setting healthy boundaries.
Right, especially if a relationship is actively harming you financially.
Exactly. And we talked about how just general money stress can really strain partnerships.
Yeah, and why being on the same page financially is so important long term.
Mm-hmm. Plus, how money situations can kind of bring hidden issues to light, and that money often represents those core needs: security, freedom.
Yeah, things that are pretty fundamental for connections to feel safe and sustainable.
Definitely.
And maybe for you listening, if you've ever felt that pang of guilt, for choosing financial stability, maybe over a relationship or helping someone out, it's important to hear that it doesn't necessarily make you a bad person.
Not at all.
As Jamie, the source implies, wanting security, wanting stability for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
that's just fundamentally human, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's okay to prioritize your own foundation. And maybe it also suggests we could all use a bit more empathy when we see other people making choices about money and relationships.
That's a great point. We rarely know the full story, do we?
Exactly. We see the choice, but not necessarily all the pressures or the history behind it. So
Mhm.
maybe holding back on quick judgments is wise. Think complexly.
Yeah, definitely food for thought. And speaking of thoughts, here's one last idea to leave you with, kind of inspired by how that Source podcast wraps up.
Oh, okay.
Think about the connection between your own well-being, and that means both emotional and financial health, and your actual capacity to show up for and nurture the relationships you care about.
Interesting link.
Yeah, like maybe making sure your own financial cup isn't empty. Maybe that's not selfish at all. Perhaps it's actually like a prerequisite,
Well,
something you need to do to be able to build and maintain healthy connections with others in the first place.
taking care of your foundation so you have something to give.
Exactly. Something to definitely mull over.